But anyway, so I'm here to talk about the Pentagon budget, and we're trying to deal with its impact on New York and Brooklyn. So of course the question is, how much are we spending? And the short answer is too much. And on my little sheet I've got 5 exclamation points. But since I'm sort of a mild-mannered guy, just imagine exclamation points, too much. Trump's most recent proposal was $750 billion for the Pentagon and related work at the Department of Energy, where they make nuclear warheads. That's more than we spent at the height of Vietnam, height of the Korean War, the Reagan buildup. It's one of the highest levels in history. And this is from a guy who said he was going to end endless wars. Of course, none of us believed that, but he did say it once. And that chews up a lot of money. It's 57 cents on the dollar of our discretionary budget, which is basically everything but Medicare and Social Security, things that have their own revenue stream that are called entitlement programs. But most of the things government does, environmental protection, administration of justice, housing, transit, labor rights, all is in that discretionary budget. So basically the Pentagon gets more than everything else the government does combined. And it's getting worse. It was, 54 cents on the dollar. Trump's new budget is 57 cents on the dollar. And it's more than the next 7 countries in the world spend combined. It's about 3 times what China spends. And of course, those 7 countries are mostly US allies, NATO allies. So if you just look at the kind of NATO alone, it spends 3 times as much as Russia. US spends 10 times as much. So the idea that the Pentagon doesn't have enough money, of course, is hogwash. But if you go inside the bubble of Washington, D.C., you'll hear all these generals and weapons executives and so forth saying that our military has been decimated, because they wanted, this many trillion, and they got just a little bit less, and so therefore they feel like they've been cheated out of their, their right, basically, to our money. So another way to look at it is, it's been a big buildup since Trump came in. The last 2 years, just the increase in Pentagon spending, not even the base, is as much as Russia spends on its entire military budget. So it's a lot of money, and we have many other good uses for it, as you'll hear from the folks who are going to speak later. So, before I get into all the further depressing details, I think we should remember that people are starting to fight back in a lot of different ways. The Poor People's Campaign, which Reverend William Barber helped to start, which is a kind of continuation of the legacy of Martin Luther King, dealing with racism, poverty, and militarism, and adding the environment and protecting the environment, which was not part of King's original Poor People's Campaign. They have been working with some colleagues of mine to develop a platform, and their platform calls for cutting $200 billion a year from the Pentagon, about $2 trillion over the next decade, which would be enough to do many, many things. You could have free college, for, public college for kids. We could rebuild our transit systems. All the things that the government says we can't afford would be on the table, would be possible. Of course, we also need to tax the rich, but that's another talk. And then Public Citizen, which is the Nader group that's been around for many years, is now talking about working on this issue and getting groups that don't normally talk about the Pentagon budget to press presidential candidates to take a stand in favor of cutting the Pentagon budget. I'm part of a group called the Pentagon Budget Campaign, which includes Peace Action, Friends Committee on National Legislation, some conservative taxpayer groups, and they just sent a note up to the Hill saying, we should cut at least $150 billion from this year's budget for the Pentagon, if not more. So there's work going on, and you're going to hear about the Code Pink Divest from the War Machine campaign, the Move the Money campaign. So I think that the good news, to the extent that there is, when they're stealing this much of our money for these terrible purposes, is that I think we have a chance to get somewhat of a ripple effect going, and actually put some movement behind this issue. If you think about some of the other issues in the campaign, there's Medicare for all, there's the Green New Deal. There's no sort of comparable call to cut the Pentagon, to sort of balance those other two. And it's directly related, because we're not going to be able to afford Medicaid for all or the Green New Deal if we're going to blow $7 trillion on the Pentagon in the next decade. So I think candidates are going to start to see that, and they're going to get pressure from progressives, particularly there's some progressives in Congress, some of the new members, who are not willing to stand for business as usual when it comes to the Pentagon. So I think that's a hopeful note. Now the question is what to cut. And one way to do it is just kind of like you would do with your kid. Just say to the Pentagon, this is your allowance, and this is all you're getting, so you figure it out. But I don't think it's going to happen that way. But I think, obviously, if you're going to reduce the Pentagon budget, you've got to stop our policy of endless war. We're at war in at least 7 countries. We also have counterterrorism operations in at least 80 countries. We spend special forces to do something or other in over 100 countries every year. It could be training, could be hunting terrorists, could be, goodwill tours. They don't even tell us exactly what they're up to, but basically it's this global reach. 800 military bases, largest arms supplying country in the world. All these things cost huge amounts of money, but they're premised on the idea that the United States somehow has the right to police the world. And of course that is not the case. And policeman may not be the right term because it makes it sound like law enforcement. We're just enforcing the rules here. But of course a lot of what we do breaks the rules of international law and causes tremendous devastation. There's a project at Brown University called the Cost of War Project. And they tried to figure out how much we've spent on the post-9/11 wars. The cost of actually fighting in the war zones, the increases in the Pentagon budget to support that, the cost of taking care of the vets coming home from the wars, the increase in our interest on our debt because we're basically putting these wars on a big credit card. All these things combined came out to $5.9 trillion, including about $1 trillion yet to be spent to take care of the vets who are going to need our help for many years to come. They also found out that by their conservative estimate, more than 350,000 people have died in these wars, most of them civilians. If you look at veterans in the United States, there's hundreds of thousands of vets with disabilities. So not only were thousands killed, tens of thousands wounded on the battlefield, but if you look at things like traumatic brain injuries, post-traumatic stress syndrome, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of veterans who need care. And the Veterans Administration budget has tripled since 2001, and it's not enough to keep up. And of course there's other issues with the bureaucracy and so forth, which could be talked about at some length. So you got to stop the wars, you got to cut the number of troops if you're really going to save money at the Pentagon. And then there's the nuclear weapons buildup, which the Pentagon started under the Obama administration and has been ratcheted up a notch by the Trump administration. And basically anything to do with nuclear weapons, they want more. They want new ballistic missile submarines, new nuclear bombers, new land-based missiles, new cruise missiles that fly from under the wings of the planes, small missiles that can come off of submarines, a so-called low-yield nuclear weapon, which basically, it's very hard to kind of enter into the twisted logic of Washington, but basically the argument they made is, well, they're not going to believe we're going to use the big ones, so we need smaller ones, and then we'll really scare them that we might use them. And of course, part of that logic is you might end up using them. They're sort of called, by the critics on the Hill, these are more usable nuclear weapons, which is the last thing in the world that we want. So all of that could be stopped. And they want to spend $1.5 trillion on that over the next 3 decades. So another huge store of money that we could use for something else. Then there's just the waste, which is quite substantial.
Sorry.
All right. All right, we're all being recorded now. So we better watch our words. So, for example, the Pentagon has this little board, it's called the Defense Business Board, and they're supposed to look at efficiency at the Pentagon. And so they figured out they could save $125 billion over 5 years just by getting rid of excess bureaucracy. You know, 2 people doing the same job, some people doing no work. They also have employed at least 600,000 private contractors, a lot of whom do the same jobs that the government employees do. And they've got so many of these contractors, they actually can't keep an accurate count. Robert Gates, when he was defense secretary, was asked, you know, how many of these contractors does the Pentagon pay for? He said, well, I really don't know. At least 600,000. And, you know, to kind of add to that, the Pentagon's the only major federal agency that's never passed an audit. So they can't actually tell us how they're spending the money. And in the last 5 years, they've actually given back about $80 billion to the Treasury. Basically gave them so much money they didn't know what to do with it. And so they handed it back. So this doesn't sound like an agency that's, you know, on hard times. But if you went to Washington, this is what you would hear from the generals, the admirals, the head of the Secretary of Defense, and so forth. So there's many reasons for this. You know, I think the biggest one is just kind of a nation addicted to war. But then there's the domestic front and the military-industrial complex. And, you know, so we're up against some powerful interests and a lot of money. You know, the defense industry, taken as a whole, all the companies that make weapons, spent about $35 million on elections in the last 2 cycles, which is a lot more than, say, peace action spent. Although maybe we're catching up, who knows? And then lobbying, they spent about 10 times that, $375 million just in the last 4 years. And a lot of this goes to very well-connected lobbyists. People basically go from, you know, the Pentagon or the State Department or the Department of Energy or the White House, and they go work as lobbyists or executives for Lockheed Martin and Boeing, Northrop Grumman, all the big weapons contractors. And so what they do is basically, you know, they're wired. Their old friends are still in government. They're basically saying to them, look, cut us some slack here. When you leave government, you can have a job like mine, making 10 times what you're making now. So there's kind of a corruption or capture of government through this system, which is called the revolving door. And it works both ways. People come from government to lobby for industry, and then people come from industry to run the government. So for example, the Secretary of Defense, acting secretary, Patrick Shanahan, was an executive at Boeing for 30 years. And he ran their missile defense division, which is not exactly an advertisement for letting somebody run something. And given that they've spent hundreds of billions of dollars in missile defense and never had a single realistic success, even in testing. So you've got a Boeing guy running the Pentagon. You've got a Lockheed Martin guy as number 3. You've got Secretary of the Air Force who just left, was a lobbyist for Lockheed Martin involved in the no-show job scandal. So you've got basically contractors running the Pentagon, and then you've got these people who've come from government, and they collude. And this is what Eisenhower was really talking about when he talked about the military-industrial complex. And it adds up to a lot of people. The industry has somewhere between 700 and 1,000 lobbyists running around the Hill. So that's, you know, almost 2 for every member of Congress. And that doesn't count people like consultants and, you know, board members, other people who do lobbying but don't register money flow into Washington. And then there's argument, their kind of argument of last resort is, oh, come on, you know, you can't stop spending this money because it'll cost jobs. And, you know, there's no question there's jobs involved. I mean, you can't build an airplane out of thin air. But almost anything else you do with the same amount of money creates more jobs. If you know, invest in green energy or education or rebuilding infrastructure, you get about 1.5 to 2 times as many jobs as you get from building weapons. But the problem is they've kind of, they sort of got us by the neck because the Congress refuses to invest in the things we need. And so people are left with the money from the Pentagon as well. You know, this is what the government's doling out. I need a piece of that. So until we have a change in Washington of our priorities, it's going to be very hard to tackle that jobs argument, even though there's many better ways to employ people. And then I think, one of the biggest things is just fear-mongering. Everywhere you turn, they're saying, there's a book called, a friend of mine wrote, Michael Cohen, Clear and Present Safety. And it's basically about how the world is a lot less dangerous than the Pentagon would have you believe. China's not going to get up in our grill, and they're not going to bomb our country, and North Korea is a relatively small country that really couldn't attack the United States without being completely wiped off the map. So they sort of walk through the different reasons why we don't have to be as afraid of the world as the Pentagon would like us to believe. And it's not just the Pentagon. There's a lot of the think tanks in Washington are funded by contractors. They're basically funded to scream from the rooftops that we're not safe. And if you hear some of the testimony in Congress, some of the generals and former secretaries of defense say, this is the most dangerous moment in my lifetime. Some of these guys are older than me, and I'm not a spring chicken anymore. Some of them lived through World War II. They lived through Nagasaki. They lived through the Nazi invasion of Europe. You can't tell me this is a more dangerous time than that was. But it's not really about reality. It's about, it's a selling job. Fear sells if you want to get more money for the Pentagon. And the most recent example of that is a little thing called the National Defense Strategy Commission. Congress appointed these experts to look at the Pentagon's defense strategy and say, is this realistic? And most of the experts were on the payroll of the defense industry. So they looked at the Pentagon strategy and said, oh no, that's a terrible strategy. We're not spending enough. And so they recommended a 3 to 5% increase above inflation for the Pentagon for the foreseeable future, which would push that $750 billion budget I talked about to close to $1 trillion within 5 years. And they talk about stuff like, well, we couldn't possibly win a war with China and also be ready to fight Russia. Well, I'm not that worried about that, because if we start a war with China, like nuclear armed power, it's not going to last very long. We're going to be risking World War III. So the strategy shouldn't be like, how do you win a war against China? It's got to be, how do you prevent a war with China? And that's not about putting ships right against their shore. It's not about building more nuclear weapons. It's not about coming up with all these war games of how you would defeat them. It's about finding ways to cooperate. We could cooperate on climate change. We could come up with some more reasonable economic interaction than the kind of trade wars that Trump is talking about. Basically look for positive grounds for cooperation, which is possible to do. Even at the height of the Cold War, there were certain areas where the US and the Soviet Union cooperated, including arms control. The whole kind of thesis of this commission, which the hawks in Congress keep pointing to and say, well, the commission says we're not spending enough, is basically to scare the hell out of us on behalf of the people who pay their salaries. They would not admit that. They would say they're doing a very careful, objective analysis of, the world situation. But of course they're going to say that. What's our way forward? I think I'm really glad there's a couple campaigns here to talk about what they're doing, and that there's things to do at the local level that kind of percolate upwards. And the thing is, the public is with us on this. There's a group called the Eurasia Group, which did a poll asking people about Pentagon spending. 3/4 of them said we're spending plenty enough or too much. So there's a base there to work with. But there's a couple things that happen. One is people say, oh, come on, Bill, it's a very powerful set of interests you're talking about. We're not going to beat them, So some people are just discouraged. They've sort of taken themselves out of the political game. And then also, people need a little more to work with, a little more information. Because when you do polls and you say, we're spending $750 billion on the Pentagon, here's what that would buy you in terms of new housing, environmental protection, how many jobs were created if you spend it elsewhere. You give people a little information about what that amount means, and the numbers of people who say we should cut the Pentagon go way up. And if you ask people what we're spending, they would probably say, oh, I don't know, 100, 200 billion, maybe a third of what we're spending. And they think we're spending all our money on the State Department. which of course is being cut dramatically under Trump. So I think there's a base to be worked with. I think some of these campaigns are going to start to get traction. And I think, as I mentioned before, we have to think big. You know, the closer you get to Washington, the smaller and smaller the demands are. You know, so it becomes like, well, let's, you know, cut $10 million from this program for a, you know, $2 billion new nuclear weapon and see if we can get, you know, enough votes to make a respectable showing and so forth, and then lose anyway. But I think, you know, people are willing to go out and say, you know, we need Medicare for all, we need a Green New Deal. We have to be able to say we're going to make deep cuts in the Pentagon, we're going to invest in the things we need. And that's only going to happen from people working locally and kind of pushing that demand up or down or over, wherever Washington is. And so I think then also we have to keep standing up against the fear campaign. There's $9 billion in the Pentagon budget to build Trump's wall. And of course, you know, he was making all kinds of statements about, you know, the men, women, and children who are fleeing poverty and violence to try to protect their families, being, you know, infiltrated with terrorists, invading the country, sending troops to the border. So he's got the thinnest of arguments, but he's still scared some of his base. They still believe this. And so we have to push back against that. We have to push back against his Muslim ban. We have to basically say, look, we're all together in this, you know. People coming into our country are not our enemies. The enemy is the Pentagon. It's this overspending on war. That's what's killing people. So, you know, we have to push our representatives to be leaders, because New York, you know, we have a fair number of liberal reps, and they'll usually vote the right way if actually a vote comes up that's relevant. But they shouldn't just be sitting back and waiting for a vote. They should be demanding a vote. They should be putting forward legislation. You know, they should be real leaders on this, not just kind of occasionally pull a lever or put their marker down for a vote. And the last thing I'll say is, in terms of things that have been encouraging to me in the last year or two, there's this awful war in Yemen that Saudi Arabia has been waging, killing thousands of people with US supplied bombs, blockading the country so humanitarian aid can't get in, bombing sewage treatment plants and water treatment plants, so there's been a cholera outbreak. It's the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, and it's made in the USA. And when the war started in 2015, there were one or two members of Congress speaking up about it, including Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut. This last year, we got both houses of Congress to vote under the War Powers Resolution for the United States to stop supporting Saudi Arabia in that war. Now, of course, this being Washington, nothing's ever over. So Trump vetoed the bill. So now we have to either get an override or we have to take the money away in some other fashion. But the point is, you know, where there were a handful of members of Congress 3 or 4 years ago, they got a majority even in the Republican Senate to say this war has to stop. And that's because of the work of a lot of groups like Peace Action, like the Friends Committee on National Legislation, like Oxfam, my colleagues at a group called Women Without War. There was this kind of unique coalition of human rights groups, humanitarian aid groups, and peace groups, working together in ways that they had not in recent times to move that issue forward. So I think there's, you know, those kinds of things are sparks of hope. And the truth of the matter is, there's no point being depressed because it doesn't make any difference. The only thing that makes a difference is doing something. So, you know, that's my spiel, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here. My name is Sally Jones from Peace Action Fund of New York State. I came over from Staten Island, and I have to tell you, we're very, very close. When you get off the ferry at South Ferry and take the R, it's about a 3-minute ride to Court Street, and you can miss that stop. So we have to remember how close we are and work together. That's how I got started in the Peace Action was through my local need to start something in Staten Island, and we formed a Peace Action of Staten Island chapter in 2002, which is how I met Charlotte Phillips and eventually Tara and many people in this room. So I am really pleased to be here. And walking up from Court Street, you look across the street and you see this building in the middle of trees and flowers, and it's an oasis, and it just visually reflects, I think we should reflect on what it is that we're about here. In the middle of all the craziness of the world, there is this oasis, and there are these people here in this room who care so deeply about these issues and are willing to put their whole lives on the line to work for a better world. So I applaud all of you in this room. So I think Bill Hartung really points us to what the real collusion is. The real collusion is the world military industrial complex, and you can add all the things that are in there, and they've been very, very successful at keeping that going, and it has been a real struggle ever since I've been a child of trying to chip away at it.